Okay, we'll get started and others might join us soon. I'm Rebecca Hubbard, Program Director for Our Fish, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our speed briefing with Dr. Lisa Borges on her latest paper, which we've nicknamed Blue Implosion, how EU failure to enforce the fish discard ban could drive fisheries management system to collapse. Just as a notice, we'll be recording the briefing, and as I mentioned before, we'll give short presentations to describe the paper and explain what it means in terms of Lisa's findings, and then also how that impacts on policy and political landscape in the EU. So I'll just very briefly outline this context to get us started. So as many of you may know, that around 2009, 2010, and for a number of years there, basically the EU reformed its common fisheries policy, its main fisheries legislation, after many, many years of overfishing, of declines in industry profits, of impacts on the marine environment. And this reform, two of the key objectives of the reform was to end overfishing and to reduce the discard of unwanted fish, which was estimated at the time to be around 1.7 million tonnes of unwanted fish being caught and killed and discarded, or caught and discarded each year. So they were these two kind of main pillars of the reform of the common fisheries policy. The two pillars are represented by the TAC setting, which is the total allowable catches. They're the fishing limits that are set each year, and that the objective in the CFP is that they should follow scientific advice for maximum sustainable yield in order that we can end overfishing and in order to also restore some of the overfished populations. And the second pillar, to minimize or decrease the discarding at sea of unwanted fish, was the introduction of the landing obligation. And that obligation, the landing obligation, sometimes shortened to the LO, or known as the discard ban, was introduced to drive an improvement in selectivity of fishing gear and to minimize this unwanted catch, but also to document the catches of all fish at sea. So that's a very simple context setting of why we're now discussing Lisa's paper, and I'll hand over to her to share with you the findings of her paper.
Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I was interested about the impact that the discard ban had on the tax system. And so just to give you a briefing of what the landing obligation was, is between 2015 to 2019, when a fisherman catches 4 fishes, and before that, he was allowed to discard a part. So he could discard, for example, 1 fish and land the other 3 remaining fish. And this is because some of the species were non-commercial, they had low value, or they were under minimum ending size, or even above the quota and their attack. Now, since 2015, progressively, fishers they're not allowed to discard. So if they catch 4 fish, they will have to land those fish. And that's what it's called, a landing obligation or a discard ban. And when this is a revolutionary policy change within European fisheries, and it really changes the behavior of fishers if it's actually implemented. And when a very big change in law is set or decided, there usually comes accompanied with incentives so that that change in behavior actually happens. And those behavior can be positive and negative, you know, the carrots and the sticks. And there are many examples of how you can do those. And so in the case of the landing obligation, there was several positive incentives given to the fishing industry to follow this change, this very big change in behavior. And some of the things were that tax and quotas were deleted so they could continue fishing without limits. There was exemptions to the discard ban, and that they continue in some level, continue to discard. But there was also increases in tax. And this is the part that I was interested in. While there were a lot of positive incentives given to implement the landing obligation, none of them were associated to negative incentives. So the sanctions to not following the landing obligation were delayed, and they haven't been applied as yet. There is no monitoring at sea to see if the fishers actually do discard or not while they are at sea. They are obliged to report their discards if they happen, for example, under exemptions, but they are not reporting. And at the end, no discards or very minimal discards have been landed. And this has led the European Commission to officially recognize that illegal and unrecorded discarding practices, it's widespread, and it's happening at the European Union fisheries level. And so what I thought it was interesting was, now that TCs were increased, I wanted to know how much was that the increases were. And that's where I did my analysis. And I calculated that every year, so since 2015, every year the TCs were increased by 36% to account for those fish, you know, the fourth fish that is now being landed. But that recently, since 2019, that percentage increased significantly also. And we are now by 50%, the TCs are being increased to account for discards. And you would think, why is this a problem? You know, they are landing the discards. What's the problem? Well, in theory, there will be no problem. And in theory, you have the circle there to say there was a landing. So the 3 fish they landed, and imagine 64% of those. And then the 1 fish they were used to discard is not accounted for in the TC, and they land those, and that is accounted for 36% of the TC. And so in total, they are actually catching 100% of that TC, and it's fine. Now, in reality, that's not the case because they're not landing those discards. The 64% is used for landings, as it was before. The 36% that it used to do for discarding is now used for commercial catch, so commercial sizes. And then they continue discarding, this time illegally, and of course outside the limit, which means the limit is no longer 100%, and they're actually 140%. So you're actually fishing much more. Which happens is that the TC at the end is not limiting fishing activity, and that's exactly the purpose of a tax system, is to limit the fishing. Another thing that I analyzed was that the increase in exemptions and how much were that given to TCs in fisheries. And there has been an incremental increase in the exemptions of the landing obligation. And at the moment, so this year, all TCs are under some kind of exemption. So most fisheries, if not all fisheries, have an exemption to discards. But remember, that's only a little percentage of discards allowed. They should be landing a lot of those discards. And why is this important? Because overfishing for many years have been decreasing in Europe. Management plans were working, there was decrease in TCs, and TCs were limiting mortality. But in recent years, it has stabilized. So it stopped decreasing. And we're not there yet. We're not with all our fisheries not being overfished or sustainable. And the problem is that now the TCs have been increasing and not limiting exploitation. This can increase again. So we can go back where we were before, which was not very good. And particularly to my analysis also in my colleagues in the scientific institutions, the basis for scientific advice may be incorrect because we assume that all these laws are implemented at least to a certain level. My analysis shows that the levels we are assuming are much higher, and that could corrupt our advice and our future advice for example, fishing opportunities in tax. So in conclusion, this is why I say in the paper that there is an implosion of the EU tax system. And I say this because discards were set that they were undermining the tax system, because fishers were allowed to continue fishing, and they were discarding the catch they didn't have quota for, and therefore there wasn't limiting exploitation. So they weren't stopping fishers to work. But at the moment, it's actually worse, because they use that argument to increase TECs. They are increased, so you can fish even more. But now they're not even followed. So you just have yet again the same system of discards happening. So it's a vicious circle, I believe, one that could really damage the management of European fisheries and all the work that we've been done until now. And so, not to end in this doom, I suppose, scenario, my perspective is very much that we gave all the positive incentives. It is time to give negative incentives. It is time to implement the landing obligation. And you can only do that by having at-sea monitoring, because discarding is something that happens at sea. So you need to be at sea to see that. And with that, then enforcement, control and enforcement will come from that. And that's it.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Lisa. Perfectly timed. I will just quickly share my screen to look at a last couple of points that we have here. So, as Lisa described, and we have time for people to ask questions if they like, the impact of this so-called implosion of the tax system in terms of what does that look like? It could lead to the decline of fish populations because we think we're fishing them at the correct level, but we're not, because there's this unknown fishing. It could lead ultimately to the decline in tax and quotas for the fishing industry because the populations decline as a result. It could also lead to the collapse of vulnerable fish populations because, as Lisa said, you know, these discards and these unrecorded discards are often also for fish that are unwanted or they have low quotas, and some of those are vulnerable fish stocks, so overfished or with small populations. And as she mentioned already, the inaccurate or the risk of undermining the scientific advice. And obviously that means that the advice that the governments are making their decisions for fisheries management it could be inaccurate, and it just basically makes it difficult to make appropriate fisheries management decisions. And the last couple of points I just wanted to reinforce was that the Lisa's findings really expose the scale of this impact. I mean, this has been an issue that conservation organizations and scientists have been recognizing and discussing for a couple of years now, but Lisa's paper really exposes the true scale of that and the risk. And in terms of relevance to this, to now, in the next 6 to 8 weeks, the EU Commission and the Agrifish Council will negotiate and decide on the tax for 2021 for around 130 stocks for both EU-only managed stocks and those that we share with Norway and other coastal states, and of course now the UK. And we're very much in line with what Lisa recommended in terms of the fact that we really need mandated remote electronic monitoring or thorough monitoring at sea of these vessels to ensure that we get proper catch documentation. And that can happen through the review of the control regulation, which is currently happening, or ministers can actually attach it as a condition when they set the tax at the end of the year in council. And as well, if they can't do that or they're not willing to do that, then we would suggest that the tax need to be set at the lower level, which is advised by scientists as the wanted level, so that we can eliminate that third segment of the pie, as Lisa showed it before. So I just wanted to just share those couple of points. And now if we have questions, there's a question here, excellent, already from Jason. Feel free to put your cameras on now. It's a small group, so if you like, you can just even ask your own question, Jason. No, I can ask it. Lisa, has there been any acknowledgement or acceptance at an EU policy-making level that this is an issue that's getting out of hand? Oh, that's right, you had bandwidth issues, no problem.
I suppose officially, at EU level, they consider the non-implementation of the landing obligation as a big issue. Have they identified specifically that is a problem with the TCs? I don't think so, at least not officially. They have so to me, because I've been in contact with them a lot of times to try to understand how they calculate the TCs. They make the issue of the landing obligation implementation on a control level, which is true. But they say that the TCs, the position of the European Commission at this point is that they can no longer propose TCs based on landings because of the landing obligation, and they have to propose TCs on the total catch, which makes a bit of a problem. And so they say that in a way their hands are tied, so they need to propose higher TCs to account for discards, even knowing that those discards are not being landed, and they want to move then to the discussion of the control regulation. Although I personally think that you can do some of the work within a TC legislation to make sure that discards are not used by all fisheries, and that you attach some conditions. Again, some of the negative incentives to the positives. So give the TC only if the fisheries prove that they are actually reporting discards or they're actually landing discards, and therefore they will be given more TC to do so. So don't give TC free as such.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Anders, go ahead with your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks, and thanks for offering this this briefing. I'd like to ask you, just about how did you arrive at the figures for illegally discarded fish? This you had this thing with the 40%. And also, I'd like to ask about monitoring, because in Denmark they introduced monitoring on some fishing boats, and the fishermen were very angry because they thought this was some kind of surveillance by the authorities all the time they were at sea. Do you have any examples of this monitoring that actually works and fishermen being happy with it?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you so much for that question, because I should say that I was more forced by Rebecca to put numbers on illegal fish as an example. So please don't quote me on that, because I did not estimate illegal discarding. That was as an example, okay? What I can say is that if 36% of that TEC is done for discarding, and it hasn't been, there will be a lot of discarding happening. Is it proportionally? Probably so. So, the more the TC you get, the more you fish and the more you discard, but that's not necessarily linear. But please don't call me on the 40%, because I did not actually estimate that, sorry. It was to give an example that more is there happening. Do we have estimates for that? And the monitoring is a good example. We do. There continues. So to monitor at sea, you either use human observers or you use electronic technologies to do so. So you use cameras, systems like remote electronic monitoring. Is there data already that you can monitor? Yes, there's still observers programs. They're still going on board to see. It's probably not as good as it used to be, because discards were legal and fisheries would not see a problem with that. And I worked many years on observers programs and that data. It is getting more tricky, more difficult to get data, to get people on board. And I would certainly recommend, for many reasons, including the COVID-19 issues, to have electronic technologies on board. And that could be cameras, but there's also more technologies where you can actually report your own data. And there is a lot of work being done by scientists on that around the world. So not really Europe, North America, South America, and others. And I could provide links for the work that we've been doing on that too.
And I can add that they have fully functional monitoring programs using cameras in Australian fisheries, in North American fisheries. They're introducing them in New Zealand and Chile. So they really are very much on the rise globally, particularly in the last 10 years. It's been a big influx. And I think, apologies, Lisa, if I forced you to put a question number on that fraction. I didn't mean to suggest that you had to you can just put a question mark. But this is the problem, is we don't know what that size is compared to what it used to be, right? Neil, do you have a question? Because you turned your video on. I'm not sure if I'm sorry if I had prevented people from putting cameras on. Seems I haven't completely dominated the Zoom system yet.
No, that was completely my choice. Yeah, I was going to ask, you mentioned that there's a chance that this kind of lack of information is corrupting the scientific advice. And I wondered if there is a chance, if nothing is done about this, will ICES kind of start factoring that into the scientific advice?
So yes. So I suppose that there's two things to the problem of not knowing what's going on within this, is not knowing what is discarding, so part of the catch, and also because it's now attached to being an illegal activity, and therefore much willing to show, of course, the industry to show that either in cameras or with observers. So obviously, and so you have a problem with that. You have a problem with actually obtaining data. When you do obtain the data, you're not sure if that actually reflects the reality, because of course, industry, the fishermen may change the behavior if they have a camera on board or not. But there's also the issue when we provide advice, we run mathematical models thinking that the TEC would be implemented or it will limit exploitation to a certain level. And then you run that model assuming that, right, that the catch is 100 tons, not 150 tons. And you do put some values there to say, well, we're not really sure. Maybe it's 110 tons. And we run the models like that to see if everything is okay. And one of the purpose I wanted on this paper, because I've been working on this for a while, was to warn my colleague scientists, but also I think most of the stakeholders, the increases in TECs are significant, okay? And that would mean that the assumptions we make when we run these models and the errors are bigger. And I don't know if that would actually make a lot of change within the advice. What I do know is it's not accounted for, and they should be. So you should increase your error instead of 10%, maybe 20, and see if that makes a difference to what you're advising to say, well, catch 100 tons. Perhaps you shouldn't, because they actually catch 120, you see? So catch maybe 80. And so this is a little bit also a wake-up call to a lot of my colleagues. And when I talked about this, because I've been working with TECs for a long time, I don't think people realize how much this is going on. It is really substantial. But I need to be a bit, and I'm not sure if Rebecca would like this, but I need to be, let's be the devil advocate of my own analysis, right? This happened before, right? Or not? It did. So I also studied tax setting before the landing obligation. And of course, ministers always wanted to have more TEC than the advice would allow them, right? And there's pushing and bargaining between member states. And so it gets to Christmas and everybody gets a present basically with the December Council. And so TECs have always been increased, okay? I think two things that it's bad is that, first of all, they use continuously this argument that it's for the discards and therefore they are legitimate. Those increases are correct. They should be done. The commission starts by actually offering already that. So you enter a negotiation with the TEC that it's much higher, and now all the TECs are automatically placed on that forward, you know, on being compared to catch. And then they might even be increased over that even. And so I think there is, again, it's a corruption of the system, I think, from the beginning. You see, where before you would start with what you're supposed to land and sell. And then there was this bargaining council, which was untransparent and I suppose, you know, ministers justify as they want. And now that is not happening. And so I also talk about this clearly in the paper, is that was that TECs increased more for other reasons? Yes. And they will always be there. You know, it's about social and economics. But I feel that this is a legitimization of widespread of increasing the TECs already in a setting, you know, the commission saying, oh, we have no choice, we have to put this equal. And I think there needs to be a discussion how to avoid this, you know, perhaps, you know, trying to figure out the impacts of this, which I believe will be negative, trying to avoid those, and trying to be perhaps imaginative at how you change a law and the tax to set to really you know, establish the objectives of the landing obligation, which was really improving sustainability of fisheries, improving their selectivity, which at this point it made it worse, and none of the fisheries are now more selective, and that's really the point. You know, it has so much potential, and it just got to be undermining the system, which it was supposed to help significantly. I think that it's a missed opportunity to me, I feel. So sorry, it's a bit of a statement there.
Just to focus on 2 points from that, I think might be useful as well, Lisa. As you said, I mean, one proposed solution that we've made and others have made has been for the ministers to set the TAC at the lower wanted level, and then to have this extra TAC only allocated to people, to fishers who have electronic monitoring or just monitoring on board at sea, so that you know, compliance can be assured. And that's an incentive, really. It is an incentive approach, but at least it could help avoid having this extra unknown unreported catch. So that's one solution that's been offered. And some even actually, for example, the Netherlands, I believe, actually uses that system. So they only allocate to their industry, their fleet, the TAC of the wanted catch, and they keep the other aside. And I don't even think they give the other out at this stage, or have done recently, to my knowledge. And the other example I just thought was worth highlighting was the North Sea cod. I mean, this is a population that has, you know, had quite a checkered history and was thought to be on the improve for a few years there. And recently, again, has been plummeting. And this is a classic example where it has come under the landing obligation. I'm sure, Lisa, you have the figures and know the details of this in the last couple of years fully. And yet we've done freedom of information requests on the landings of undersized North Sea cod, and it's virtually zero, whereas they're receiving an increase in their TAC around 30%, or they were in the past. So Lisa, you might have the specific details, but that's a classic example. So right now the North Sea cod could be being overfished at least 30%, which may be, you know, a reason why its population is still crashing, despite the fact that we're setting the TAC at the so-called or closer to the scientific advice. Lisa, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I would also comment. Well, the North Sea cod was also, so I talked about the TEC's increases, which was an unintended impact of the landing obligation, but there were more. And so one of the positive incentives, I would say, the European Commission gave member states and the industry particularly, was that they removed the effort scheme, which was extremely unpopular with the industry in the North Sea. So that was a limitation of being at sea fishing. So not only did they have a limitation of how much they could sell, land and sell, they also had a limitation how many days they would be at sea. And that would control, you know, the discards also, because they couldn't be fishing. And that was really strong. It was really unpopular, but it was really strong. And it really, I believe, it was one of the key things that helped recover cod stock in the North Sea. But when you got to the landing obligation, they said, we don't need the IZC because everything is being controlled. We no longer have discards, so let us remove it. And so we increased the TCs, we removed the limitation that was there, and you have then the days to fish your TC more that it was given and the legal discards you can do. You see, and the cod immediately reacted. You see exploitation increasing and the cod was really in the balance going down. And I find that it's a very good example of the negative impact that the landing obligation actually had within the European system. I didn't went through, you know, the effort scheme because I focus on this paper on the tax, but this is also a classic thing. I think I actually mentioned in the paper that, you know, removing of the effort scheme really had an impact also of the landing obligation. So again, you know, the positive incentives were there, but there was never the other part of the bargaining. That, you know, you need to, there is something to be returned. You know, you get less legislation, you get less limitation, but you need to increase your transparency and you need to show that you're following it. And that didn't happen in Europe. And I suppose one of the things, the problem in Europe is that the limitations are given at the European level, but the control is not made at the European level, it's at member state level. And then it gets to discussions. Quota management, it's also made at member state level so they can choose. So there is also a limitation where, you know, the European Commission can come in and on.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions on specific or any specifics, I guess, of the report or the study?
It's Maria Delaney here. I just had a question on the at-sea monitoring. I know you mentioned the Netherlands there, but I was wondering if it's happening in many other countries and for smaller fleets, say not the bigger boats. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry. So yes, so around Europe, there's happening in the Netherlands, there's happening in Denmark, happening in Germany, there is Belgium, Spain, there is a lot going on in Scotland for small scale fleets, Scotland and Wales. So the UK, I think that there's also happening in Ireland, but I'm not sure. I think there is happening in Ireland, or at least there was. And so there's a lot of testing and experimenting. There's happening in France also. So I'm thinking about the people who were in my meeting. So a lot of the countries there is. I know that there is a lot of trial for, in France there's a lot trialing in outermost regions for the French territories, which have very small boats and not a lot of technology. There's also testing in the Azores, for example. And there's also testing around the world. And I specifically usually talk about Chile because it's an example I know well, because they're actually setting up compulsory at-sea monitoring, observers and electronic monitoring in their whole fisheries. And this is a country where the coast is pretty big, a lot of big boats. Of course, their small scale is like 20 meters vessels, which is not the same for us because we have much smaller vessels, but they're still doing it. So they're coming in stages. And so there's a lot going on in Europe. I think there's a lot will come to testing and experimenting on it. Again, I'm the co-chair with an American colleague on a working group that we talk about programs, and we're about to release our second year report. And we wanted actually to give examples of programs in Europe and around the world where electronic technologies have been established. And of course, we talked about the pandemics and how, you know, those programs were not impacted, of course, by this, while observers programs basically stopped all over the world, and fisheries have not been monitored as in many years before. And so it has been, so to answer your question, yeah, there has been a lot of work. I could also look, because I believe you're Irish, I can also look for Irish programs within the Marine Institute. I believe so, but I'm not actually now. But for many of the European countries, most of them will have at least a program or not. Around the Baltic, so Sweden also has it. Finland also associated to protected species. So a lot going on.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
And Maria, just to add there, I just put the website of transparentfisheries.org in the chat. It's actually the coalition, a website for the coalition, a coalition of EU NGOs that are working on the review of the control regulation, fisheries control regulation, in which actually the Commission proposes the introduction of electronic monitoring across across the entire EU, obviously. And we recently did a map of pilot projects and full-scale programs that run REM. And as Lisa said, there are actually a lot, I was going to say tons, but a lot of REM pilot projects that have happened across in EU countries for years, in fact. Anda's point about Denmark introducing it into one fishery this year. Well, Denmark actually started running pilots on REM, in the 2000s. So, and was really a leader in the technology over 10 years ago. But now we have, unfortunately, the EU's fallen behind and a lot of other countries have picked up. So we actually have a really good report that summarizes where there are projects, and I think it's digital. So I will get that, and we can also circulate that information for you all as well. Because
that sounds brilliant. Thanks very much.
Great. Any other questions? I think we promoted this as a speed briefing, a bit like speed dating. But so, and we understand as journalists, you all have very busy schedules. So we don't need to carry on any longer than we can provide you with useful information. So if you have any questions, any more questions, please shout out now. Nope. Okay, great. Well, I think what we might close the briefing here. We'll send around a follow-up email with the briefing. If you would like a copy of Lisa's paper, you need to request it directly to Lisa as the author. It hasn't been published just yet, has it, Lisa? But it's in press.
It's available. And also because the journal has a year that they want to have it's not freely available. But I can send it if you would ask me as an author. I could send my own copy. There's apparently there's production problems due to COVID. And so they're having a backlog of putting the papers actually online at the journal, but it's completely accepted and finalized. It's just not online at the link. But okay. Please send me a message, or if you like to ask me something else, I'm also happy to chat. But please don't quote me on the legal number. That was my fault.
Well, we will we'll amend your PowerPoint, and we'll send around copies of the PowerPoints, and we'll amend the PowerPoint with some question marks instead, and we'll circulate those with the email and contact details. Okay. So thanks everybody for taking the time today and joining us. I hope you found it very useful, and please don't hesitate to get in contact if you have further questions. Perfect. Thank you.